Record. Good evening, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to those who are joining us in the room. Welcome to those who are joining us here on Zoom. And welcome to our dear friends who, for one reason or another, were unable to be here tonight, but you asked me to record and share the recording. And so you'll be connecting across time and space as we always do. We are in a very important course and at a very exciting juncture. Of course, this course, Book Smart, is reviewing all the different genres of Jewish Torah literacy. There is so much wisdom, so much accumulated knowledge that the Jewish people have been preserving and teaching and studying and developing over 3,300 plus years. If you have the book, so you might want to just take a fast peek at our timeline or map, if you will. And if you'll take a look at the orange color, which is the second stripe on our map, and again, I know some of you might not have it, you will note that the second line, the orange line, is a reference to the Talmud and its commentaries. And you can see the timeline, the eras, the times that it was developed. But I don't want you to spend too much time looking at it. I just want you to have that visual as we embark on a very important discussion. So we need to start, well, first of all, by dedicating tonight's class and the remainder of Book Smart to the memory of our dear friend Aviva Bat Esther. Was Aviva's mother, was Esther, right, Doctor?
Aviva's mother was
Orca. And so we'll dedicate our class to Aviva Moskowitz, a person, a wonderful tzaddikus, a righteous woman, in my humble opinion, someone who valued Jewish literacy, the land of Israel. She cherished her family. She was a person of generosity, of conviction, and we miss her. We remember her fondly, and the kavod is mine to have the opportunity to dedicate this class and this course to honor her memory. May her memory be a blessing, and her memory lives on and will live on, and we'll remember her impact and the goodness that she brought to the world, to her community, and to her family. And so we're going to ask the question, what is the Talmud? Today, of course, we're talking about the Talmud. That's lesson 3 in Book Smart. What is the Talmud? So there is a joke. And, I don't like reading. I don't do good, but I got to read this for you. A person comes to the rabbi and says, my Jewish friends are always telling me that there's something called a Yiddish cup. There's a sharp Jewish analytical way of approaching and analyzing life and stuff. Is there anything to it? Is it true that studying the Talmud makes a person a little sharp or smart? So the rabbi says, well, let's try this. Let's say there are 2 thieves who climb down a chimney. When they emerge, one's face was all black with soot, and the other one had a very clean face. The rabbi asked the man, who do you think washed his face? So the man says, Rabbi, that's simple. The man with a dirty face cleaned his face. The man with a clean face had no need to wash. The rabbi says, really? You think so? Think again. And he started using a Talmudic logic kind of tune. He says, the guy who went down the chimney and he saw his friend had a dirty face, he assumed his face was dirty. So he washed his face. The guy whose face is dirty, however, looks at his friend's face is clean, and he assumed his face is clean. So who washed their face? The one that's face was clean. Who didn't wash the face? The one that was dirty. The man says, oh, your rabbi, you're right. So obviously the man with a clean face washes his face. Wrong again, says the rabbi, banging his fist on the table in a Talmudic style. You're not thinking logically. Do you really think 2 people would both at the same time go down the chimney and one would have a clean face and one would have a dirty face? Of course not. So they both had to wash their face. Says the man, oh, yeah, you don't get it. 2 ganovim, 2 thieves are coming down the chimney. You think they're going to go and make a stop in the bathroom to wash up their face? They're going to grab the jewelry and run. And so this is an example of how you can take one puzzle and explore it 3 or 4 different angles. And this is a famous joke used with some degree of success to illustrate the nature of the Talmud and its analytical approach to attempt to explore, to assess, and to analyze, to come up with the best conclusion. Now, I want to acknowledge we didn't really define the Talmud yet. We just gave you an anecdote that portrays this kind of what we call pilpul, this intellectual gymnastics to probe and seek to uncover the truth of the matter. As I catch over the slides here, you can see we have the same chart that you hopefully have in front of you. And here, this is the timeline of the Talmud, and we'll get to it in a moment. So you have something called pilpul. Pilpul is a discussion in which a concept, an idea, a puzzle is probed and analyzed from every different angle. And this is one of the primary methods or formula that are used in the Talmud. But what is the Talmud? And why is the Talmud, whatever it is, such an important text, such an important work for the Jewish people? As a matter of fact, after the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which comprises of what we describe as the written Torah, there is no text more central to Jewish life, Jewish thinking, than the Talmud. But what is the Talmud? Give me a second. Well, I wasn't planning on doing that, but this book, what I'm holding in my hand over here, what is it? You want to take a guess what I'm holding in my hand? I know the settings here don't make it super clear. This, correct. If you said the Talmud, Irma, you got it right. This is a volume of the Talmud, but in a way you'd be incorrect. And pardon me for saying this. Why would you be incorrect? Number one, this is not the whole Talmud. This is a single volume. This set has 63 different volumes. The Talmud is a work that is comprised of 63 different texts. So this is 1/63 of the Talmud. You want to know what the topics that are covered in the Talmud? So give me a second. Let me just, I can actually tell you if you'll turn to the back of this lesson, assuming you're in the book at all. The lesson begins page 96. But if you'll turn to page 134, and I want you just to bookmark this, and you'll see here is a map of the Talmud. So you have the red, which is the order called seeds, which is about agriculture. The next page, 135, you have Moed, which is about laws revolving around Jewish holidays, and so on and so forth. You can take a look at that at your own time. That's why there are so many different volumes. Every volume has a different subject, a different theme. While we talk, I want to just show you here on the screen, and then your book, if you're on page 96, you can actually see a snapshot or something like that of a page in the Talmud. And I don't expect this. If this looks like Chinese, then we're doing things right. So have no fear. But what you're looking at is a page of the Talmud. You might notice that although there's a lot of text and it might make you dizzy, there are actually a variety of different texts in different fonts, in different sizes, in different layouts. And the truth is, the book that I called the Talmud, that Irma told us is the Talmud, is really not just a single work, but a collection of a primary text with a multitude of commentary. It's also not a single author. It records several hundred years of teachings, discussions, deliberations, debates, spanning approximately 600 years, from around 100 BCE, which we're talking about, that's 100 when the number started going down. So after the year 100, it was 99, then 98, and so on, all the way to the year 500. Approximately 600 years of scholarship is encapsulated on this page, or in this work, 63 volumes. And so there are many voices, many perspectives, many opinions. But what is the Talmud? So the Talmud is comprised of, well, actually, hold on. If you have a book, if you have the book, page 96, 97, it gives you some of the terms that we're going to show in the film. But I just want to show you briefly here. This central column, which I think in the slides, you should be given. Oh yeah, we're gonna address it more exhaustively in a second. But suffice it to say, this is the text. This is how the text looks. Before we talk more about the history of the Talmud, the origin of the Talmud, and the structure, there's another reason why the Talmud is so important. And the answer is because the Talmud is something that really captures the notion of Jewish learning. Jewish learning, when you talk about a Jew who studies, who learns in a traditional old country manner, most likely you're describing the Talmud. And Talmud is almost a text that captures a way of life for people, folks across different age groups, denominations, students in yeshiva. For example, myself, when I studied in rabbinic school, the bulk of our time was spent examining, exploring this text. Most of practical Jewish law, how a Jew ought, or how the Torah prescribes Jewish living, that too is from this text. And so this is not just a text, which we're going to talk about what's inside of it, but it is a universe. It informs and inspires a Jewish way of thinking, a certain dialect of conversation, and how people who study the Talmud understand the world around us. And then aside for that, the Talmud captures a snapshot of what Jewish life was over a time where there's very, very little external evidence and insight into the way of life. Today, thankfully, there are scholars that have done a lot of work to try to put together and connect the dots between the historic references within the Talmud and what we know from other sources, but it's an incredibly important fundamental work. What is the Talmud really? The Talmud is comprised of 63 tractates. And what it does is it records the teachings, discussions, deliberations of hundreds of sages over 600 years, and it has vast numbers of commentaries. Why is it important? We got ahead of ourselves. Why is it so important? Well, because the Talmud encompasses the whole gamut of Jewish topics. It informs Jewish spirituality. It informs Jewish philosophy. It informs Jewish practice, ethics, history, and so many other ideas that we know that are known to be Jewish. Most of those conversations can be found to start in the Talmud. And so in a sense, the Talmud is a most authoritative document. But most importantly, the Talmud is the documentation of the Jewish oral tradition. As we mentioned, God gave the Jewish people a book, a text we call the Torah or Tanakh. And from then on, for several hundred years, all you had was an oral tradition, an oral dialogue. And we're going to discuss a lot more about why things changed. But suffice it to say, this is the embodiment, the representation of the Jewish oral tradition. And now, my dear friends, the Talmud is a work that spanned a long period starting around 2,000 years, 1900 years, until around 1600 years. And now, before I keep on talking, I want to give you a moment to enjoy a wonderful video, as always, produced by the Jewish Learning Institute on the subject of the Talmud. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. And after we see the video, I will make sure we'll fill in all the blanks. So I know we've been teasing you here. We've been telling you what it's comprised of, how many books there are, but we have not yet really touched upon the glorious, wonderful history of the Talmud. And that's something we're going to do shortly.
This is the Talmud. 63 tractates, 523 chapters, 2 million words.
I'm not seeing it.
After the Bible, the Talmud is the most important work of Jewish literature.
We're going to reset. Hold on.
Okay.
Stop share.
And has defined.
You see it now?
Yes, I
No.
see.
Remember, you still don't see it?
Loading.
It looks like it's loading.
This is the Talmud.
Hold on, but Lynn, you said you see
I
it?
don't hear it. Now I don't hear it. I see it, but I don't hear it now.
Oh yeah. Okay,
We
hold
don't
on.
hear
Let's try this
No,
one more
I
time.
saw
Thank you,
it
folks.
before and heard it before, but now I'm seeing, but I'm not hearing it.
Yeah.
All right,
I'm
let's
not
try
hearing it
this.
either.
Yeah, well, I just stopped it. Let's try this one more time. Again, let me know. Don't thumbs up. I can't see you. Just tell me if you hear it. Good.
This is the Talmud.
Yes.
63 tractates, 523 chapters, 2 million words. After the Bible, the Talmud is the most important work of Jewish literature and has defined Jewish learning for centuries. From the outside, the Talmud looks like a book, albeit a rather formidable book, but from the inside, it looks more like this. Why is it so complicated? To decipher the Talmudic daf, or folio page, we first need to understand what the Talmud is, how it came to be created, and what a volume of Talmud contains. A volume of Talmud is not a book, it's a library of books. A typical volume of Talmud might include more than 100 works, composed by hundreds of authors over a period of more than 1,800 years. Let's deconstruct the daf and then rebuild it layer by layer. The oldest part of the Talmud is the Mishnah. Compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the Holy Land more than 1,800 years ago, the Mishnah was the first officially transcribed record of Torah law, which up until that point had been handed down through the generations as an exclusively oral tradition. The Mishnah, however, is very concise, almost a shorthand. Over the next 300 years, many hundreds of Torah sages analyzed, discussed, and debated the teachings contained within the Mishnah, and these discussions became the Gemara, which together with the Mishnah constitute the Talmud. There are many pages of Gemara for each Mishnah, as these discussions often range far afield to include many additional teachings covering virtually every topic under the sun. The Gemara was completed in the beginning of the 6th century in Babylonia, written mostly in the Aramaic dialect that was the spoken language of the Jewish people at the time. Studying the Talmud is a challenging task. It requires knowledge of its often obscure terminology, being familiar with the many references to parallel Talmudic teachings, and an ability to follow the complex, multi-tiered arguments presented in its discussions. In fact, the Talmud presented on its own would be a closed book to all but the most advanced Talmud scholar. So over the centuries, hundreds of commentaries were written to decipher, explain, and discuss the Talmudic text. Some of these were published alongside the Talmud itself in recognition that they are indispensable to any attempt to properly understand the text. Rashi, the most basic and comprehensive of all Talmudic commentaries, was placed alongside the Talmudic text in some of the earliest manuscripts and published editions of the Talmud. But when one Talmud scholar writes a commentary, other scholars will offer alternative explanations or have additional questions and issues they feel the need to address. Flanking Rashi on the daf is Tosfot, which is actually an anthology of commentaries by dozens of sages, including a number of Rashi's disciples and descendants. The analytic and dialectic style of the Tosfot commentaries strongly influenced the manner in which Talmud has been studied over the centuries throughout Europe and beyond. Over the years, more elements were added to the daf to aid the student's navigation of the text. But there's a limit to how many commentaries a page can hold, even an oversized folio page of Talmud. So other major commentaries were added to the back pages of each tractate for ready reference, and many, many more. In addition, many more commentaries on the Talmud were published and continue to be published each year in separate volumes. Today, if you wish to research a complex issue, compare and contrast different opinions on a topic, trace back their sources, examine the issue's applications in multiple fields, you can open multiple windows on your screen and even hook up more screens to your computer. But centuries before Windows 1.0, centuries before electronic information technologies, Jews committed to exploring the multi-chambered laboratory of wisdom called the Talmud had already invented the original hypertext, the daf.
So that's the case. The video's
Rabbi, I have a
making.
question. I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Is the Talmud only written in Hebrew?
So the Talmud is actually written with Hebrew font, with Hebrew text, but it is actually in Aramaic, a blend of Jewish Aramaic, which is a specific dialect spoken by most Jews actually in that time,
Right,
and Hebrew.
right. But is it ever translated into English or
It
never?
is certainly translated into English. There was
It
a
is.
work that is the oldest translation, to my knowledge, called the Cincino translation, which is a little bit arcane today. Pardon me for saying that. Then you have a work called the Art Scroll by Masora Publication, and it's or the Steinsaltz Gemara. So there's two very, very modern English translations, and one of them, so you have the Schottenstein Gemara by Art Scroll, and then you have the Steinsaltz Gemara, which is actually available on the internet. There's a website called sefaria.org, and on that website you can actually find the translations of the Talmud. I will tell you, however, even a translated version warrants exhaustive study, because just to translate a word, there's a lot of dialogue and there's a lot of very deep ideas and thinking. I actually give a daily Talmud discussion every morning, and it's a thrill, but it's also one of my hardest daily challenges to navigate the Talmud. So again, back to, we saw the video, and they did a nice job of stripping here. I'm sorry, just one second, of stripping the Talmud of all its commentaries, so you can see that the core, as they showed, and I showed you, and you can see it in your book, is the Talmud, and all around it, that's other commentaries. Irma.
I just wanted to say that years ago, when I was in school, first of all, they did not teach like Gemara. They didn't teach it to girls. They only taught it to the boys. But all these different translations that he's talking about, Schottenstein and the Art Scroll and so forth, these are things that made it possible for so many people to actually really understand something.
But in addition to that, today, the most Jewish day schools do teach Talmud to girls. So I'm sure your grandchildren are studying Talmud.
I did learn Gemara in high school mainly. I went to Frisch in New Jersey. It's like a modern Orthodox.
Yes. So today the Talmud is a lot more accessible. Something else that's pretty wild is that in Korea and in Japan, I believe they have translated versions of the Talmud, because there's this notion that Jewish people are smart and they think maybe it has to do with the Talmud. And so there's a great appreciation for the Talmud in different countries in the Far East. And anyways, let's go through the Talmud a little bit over here. So Judaism.
Rabbi, I have another
yes?
question. I'm sorry.
Please do.
The last question I have is, when you're studying the Talmud, because there's so many books and so many pages, you can't really study the whole thing. So how do you pick and choose what you're going to study?
So the way I introduce my daily session is we're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time.
Really?
And just like any project, you just got to start with the first step. And so when I started teaching it, I taught the first tractate first and the second tractate next. But sometimes people select specific tractates for different reasons. For example, some are longer than others. So the one that I'm teaching currently has 157 double-sided pages. So that's over 300 pages of this dense text. Then you have other tractates that are a good bit smaller or less pages. And so sometimes you might choose it by size or by subject. You have a tractate that talks about the laws of the Sabbath. You have a tractate that talks about, and we're going to explore a little text today that talks about the tort law and possession kind of law, more legalistic. There's tractates that talk about the holiday of Passover or the New Year or the Jewish calendar. And so there are many, many different subjects.
And how are the 63 volumes organized?
They are organized by subject. So there are 6 divisions And actually, if you'll look in the back of your book, you'll notice that not in the back of your book, in the back of this course, I pointed out page 134 through 139, I believe. 134, no, yeah, 134 to 140. You have all the different books of the Talmud. I don't want to go through that now because I want to try to give a little bit of the history and understanding. So for some reason, the way we presented the Talmud, we teased a little bit its content, and then we're going to talk about its history. And so Judaism is all about constant learning. And the oral tradition was about preserving the knowledge accumulated and passed to us from a previous generation, and then adding and enriching that tradition. And the Talmud has always been the center of that dialogue. So as I pointed out before the video, Talmud is not a book. It's a whole lot more. It's a way of thinking and a way of relating to the world. Talmud can be described as a language of the Jewish psyche and the flavor of Jewish life. And I'll tell you something else. There is a linguist. There are a number of linguists. There's a linguist called John McWhorter. Maybe you're familiar with him. He's in New York, and he has a number of podcasts, and he's very popular. He's written a number of books. And so someone forwarded me a podcast that he gave about the Talmud. And he describes a Jewish dialect called Yeshivish. What is Yeshivish? Yeshivish is a dialect that developed by students who spend so much time studying the text of the Talmud that they incorporate certain languages into their day-to-day life. And so you wouldn't understand it, but if they were communicating to one another, they might intersperse in their kind of conversational English ideas, expressions that are in Hebrew and Aramaic that are born out of the Talmud. If I have time, after we end the formal part of the class, I'm going to try to do a fast Google and see if I could find a clip of him talking about this dialect called Yeshivish, which what it does is it conveys not just a language, but a way of thinking. So what's unique about the Talmud? The Talmud is the most important authoritative record of the oral tradition. And it's also where most of the Jewish scholarship unfolds. It's like the framework or the canvas upon which much of Jewish scholarship and discussion of Jewish law unfolds. Let's understand a little more about this record of the oral tradition. So we know that the Jewish people received a written text, the Bible, and an oral tradition that were all the elaboration, the discussions, as well as we mentioned last week, principles, rules from which and how to extract. Oh, we don't see the people. Do we see them? Okay.
No. See it.
Yeah.
I see a
methods of
blank screen.
You see a blank.
Blank.
Tell me
blank.
something now.
No, blank.
Yeah. Okay. This slide is blank. Correct. Just give me a moment. We're playing around over here for the purpose of the recording. Just give me a second. I'm going to put everyone back on the screen. But right now you see a blank screen. Do you see me too?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So what is the Talmud? So the Talmud actually has two segments. The Talmud is divided by a text called Mishnah and a text called Gemara. If you'll join me on page 98, this is the way Maimonides, well, really 98 and 99. 98 is the English, 99. Maimonides gives a little bit of a history of how the oral Jewish tradition was recorded. And he says like this: all commandments given at Sinai, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, so bear with me, were given with explanations. The explanations called the oral tradition. Moses wrote the whole written Bible by hand. The explanations he did not transcribe. He instructed them to the elders, to Joshua, to the rest of Israel. And from the time of Moses until many, many hundreds of years later, in the time of a rabbi called Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, these ideas remained in the domain of the Jewish mind, conversation, and heart. They were not approximately, I would say, 800 plus years. 800 plus years. Now, some of those texts actually were recorded, but they weren't published. They were private diaries. So people that were students of the Talmud, it wasn't called the Talmud, the oral tradition, would make notes, but those notes were never published or provided for broad consumption. That was in Hebrew initially, and then when the conversational language, little off topic, but if you look in the Bible, there is a progression where initially the Bible's primary language is in Hebrew. And towards the end of the Bible, in the book of Daniel, when Jews end up in the diaspora and they end up in Babylonia and beyond, we find vast introduction of the language of Aramaic. But that's really off of this topic. So each generation, the head of the court or the great scholars or prophets of the generation would make their own notes that they received from their teacher, and they would convey them orally. Their students, similarly, would write them down, they would discuss them, and they would develop them. And this is how it went for many hundreds of years, until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. What went wrong in the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi? So in brief, what happened is terrible Jewish oppression. We call them the Hadrianic revolt and the following restrictions. And it became very, very hard for the Jewish people to practice. Many, many Jews were being killed, and they realized that it would be impossible to preserve this knowledge if all of the repositories of that information are killed. And so a fateful decision was made to transcribe those teachings so they would not be lost. Now, what happened before that was transcribed? There's another segment of the oral tradition that I need to point out, and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm confusing you. What happens if there was a question or a doubt? What the Jewish tradition is. You know what happens? We talk about Hanukkah. People call me before Hanukkah. I get hundreds of calls. Rabbi, how do you light the menorah? The left side, the right side, where do you place it? So what did you do back then if you had a question? You know what they did? If the folks didn't know the answer, they would bring it to the high court. And the high court, called the Sanhedrin, would give that information. And so there really were no debates. It was a body of 71 judges, and the majority, the decision endorsed by the majority became Jewish law. And so there were the oral ideas that were conveyed. There were the developing areas of Jewish tradition that maybe they didn't know. And so they would seek out the consensus of the high court. But then what happened is the high court, on page 102, text 3, the high court is shut down. The Jews are dispersed. And so Rabbi Yehuda chose to transcribe it before it was all lost. And that is the nutshell. That is the nugget contained in text 3. So what is the Mishnah in short? The Mishnah is the ideas that Rabbi Yehuda thought were going to be lost forever, transcribed in a very, very short hand. Why did he transcribe them in a shorthand? Because they needed to be committed to memory. The more limited the text is, the greater the ability to commit it to memory. The longer a text is, the harder it is to commit to memory. And so therefore, it was recorded in a very, very shorthand. If you want to look now on page 104, here we get the 6 orders. Lino asked about it. I gave you another page to look, but you can look here on page 104. In short, you have seeds, appointed times, marriage and divorce, damages, sacraments, and the laws of ritual purity. Those are the 7 general categories of time. In temple times, ritual and purity was very important. Jews were an agricultural society with many regulations about how to manage the field and what needed to be given to charity, to the poor, and so on. Holidays are a very Shisha, Sidrei, Mishnah, the 6. The 6 orders of the Talmud. The Mishnah is not a small book. 63 tractates, 523 chapters, 4,184 Mishnahs, specific codes. And they cover the bulk of Jewish law. But here's the problem. There was a lot that was not in the Mishnah. What was not in the Mishnah? So I want to skip in the slides from. So you have the Mishnah, which is shorthand, and then you have the Gemara, which was composed 300 years later. So we said, here's the history of the oral tradition. There was a 500-year gap after the Bible was written. The oral tradition was not transcribed. The Sanhedrin, again, I'm just going back. The slides are catching up to what I already said. The Sanhedrin was a court of 71, and they would be the final authority. 6 orders of the Mishnah include what we just discussed. So what's not in the Mishnah, and why is there an additional text? Number 1, Rabbi Yehuda chose to transcribe those texts that we call the Mishnah that include Jewish law. He wanted it to remain part of a verbal and oral dialogue. So he purposely wrote it in a shorthand that you would have a challenge to decipher if there was not a continued relationship between teacher and student, previous generation and the next. So he provided cliff notes to hedge and to make it easier to continue an oral tradition, but he did not make obsolete the Jewish intergenerational institution that's so important to Judaism, which is conveying ideas from one generation to the other. So being that he wrote it in shorthand, there's a lot of blanks that need to be filled in. Number two, he only included legal issues. There is not a lot of ethical, moral, historical information, narratives, parables. All of that was left out of the Mishnah and was only maintained in the oral tradition. See, only the rulings and the discussions. And third of all, Rabbi Yehuda could only write down the discussions that happened before he lived. But as to the new developments, the new questions, the new challenges that develop with unfolding technology, economics, travel, obviously Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi cannot talk about things that have not yet happened, just as the Constitution doesn't talk about computers and the internet and smartphones and social media, because we could only talk about ideas that exist in the world in the moment we live in it. And for all these three primary reasons, it was shorthand. It was purely a legalistic text. And as time passes, new questions develop. Therefore, there was a continuing oral dialogue that was concurrent with the study of these Mishnah texts. All those conversations eventually are transcribed, and that is essentially what the Talmud is. Give me one more moment. I'm sure there's questions.
Wait a minute.
So the Mishnah was the core. Well, the Mishnah is the core text. There was still an oral process where many ideas were not transcribed, and that is the Gemara. Lynn, bevakasha.
Well, I was going to just ask, well, what is the Gemara then? But now you're going
So
to
the
talk
Gemara
about that.
are all
Okay.
the conversations that Rabbi you. Yeah. No, well, listen, this is exciting, and these are big mysteries. And listen, I'm trying my best. It's hard to And so the Mishnah, this shorthand text, all the elaboration, all the discussion, all of the things that had not yet been discovered at the time of the writing of the Mishnah, that becomes the essence of the Talmud of the Gemara. Now, I want to just tell you one more thing. You're probably confused.
Yes.
Talmud and Gemara are just about synonymous. Gemara is one way to describe this, the elaboration, all the stuff that was once oral, and then the word Talmud really is the same thing. As a matter of fact, Talmud means study, and Gemara means study. It's the same word. Just Gemara is Aramaic, and Talmud is Hebrew. Well, I don't know if Talmud is exactly Hebrew. It's a developed Hebrew, but the word limud means a study. So Talmud means to study, and Gemara means to study. Yeah.
Rabbi,
It's
Rabbi,
not, yes, Lynn.
is
Yes.
the Gemara not shorthand? Is it in law? It's updated, but is it not a shorthand like the Mishnah?
The Gemara is much, much longer,
Mhm.
lengthy, and captures a whole lot more information in a longer form. Absolutely.
Right.
Now,
Is it true to say that the Gemara is completing the Mishnah?
yes, the Gemara in many ways is completing the blanks that the Mishnah didn't discuss. So the Mishnah is shorthand. So you have to read between the lines. We say, there's an English phrase, we say to read between the lines, because a lot of information can be read, even if it's not explicitly, by the language one chooses or the things one chooses not to address. And so the Talmud really is all the things that are in between the lines that had to be conveyed by teacher to student. Eventually it gets transcribed. So just to recap one more time, I'm going to go back in time on the slides.
So,
Just really
okay.
briefly. Mishnah was composed in the 2nd century, after it seemed like Judaism is going to be totally forgotten. Rabbi Yehuda writes it down in a method that would be not convenient, but feasible to commit to memory. And this was the first written summary of the oral tradition. This is the first written text that elaborates and fills in the blanks of the Bible.
Do we have it?
The Gemara?
No, the original was he wrote.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mishnayot is those texts that Rabbi Yehuda wrote.
the one he wrote.
Yes.
Where is
I mean,
it?
we don't have the original handwriting. We don't have the original manuscript, but we have that very word. So Mishnah is around 200 and the Gemara is around 600. So for another 400 years or so, these discussions, debates, analysis continue to be recorded, preserved, developed, and then transcribed. So that's just so the Mishnah and then the Gemara.
So Rabbi,
this-
one question,
Yes.
Rabbi.
Yes,
So
go
if
ahead.
you were to study this, then would it be more useful to study the Gemara rather than the Mishnah? Would you get a better
Very-
understanding of it?
Very good. So let me explain one last thing, which will help you. You're asking a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. The Gemara ultimately also incorporates the Mishnah. So the way the Gemara works is it quotes the Mishnah, and then that
Mhm.
is the springboard for all the ensuing dialogue and conversation. And in a moment, we're going to actually explore a text of the Gemara.
Okay, so so you would study, if you had a choice of what you had to study, would you study the Gemara because it's more
Short.
it's longer and it gives better explanations?
Yeah, I mean, it's not competition. It's not two different
Well,
products.
no, it's not competition, but I'm just saying, if you had a choice of which one you were going to study, would you learn more from the Gemara?
I don't know if this helps, but basically you read the Gemara, the Mishnah, it is kind of like the overview. Like it kind of has like a paragraph, like, oh, this is the Mishnah, and then the Gemara will start and kind of expand on that, right, Rabbi?
Let's see.
Like
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking for a picture again. I want to show you.
Mishnah like introduces the topic in the Gemara, and
Yeah,
then
yeah. So
like,
here, so
and
let me
then
just
you
show
have-
you.
yeah.
Yes. So the Mishnah is when you go to the Talmud, the first text is going to be the Mishnah,
Mhm.
and then there's and we're gonna. The reason why I'm hesitating going to all that Shira said is because we're gonna actually discuss this in a second. But basically, you have the Mishnah quoted first, and then you have all this discussion and all this elaboration, and it's launched off of the text of the Mishnah.
So
Let
it's
me
all
find
together. It's all written
Yes.
all together, okay?
It's yes,
Is that what
yes,
you're
yes,
saying?
something like that.
I
Yes.
see. Okay,
So again, what is the Mishnah to the Gemara? The Mishnah is the original shorthand text, and the Gemara is all those things that were part of the tradition, but not yet recorded, or not all, but much. And actually, after the Mishnah was finished, at the close of the Mishnah, there was a big crisis for the Jews of Israel, and the bulk of Jewish scholarship took place no longer in Israel, but in ancient Iraq or Babylonia. And if you'll turn to page 106 in your student book, and I wish they included this on the slides too, but they didn't.
I still don't have
You'll
the
see a
book,
map.
Rabbi.
Oh, I left you the book in your lobby, didn't I? You never got it?
You did? Nobody
Yeah.
ever told me about it.
I never got
All
my
right, I'm
book.
pretty sure I left it for you.
I don't have
Yeah.
a book
Left
either.
it for me? You did? I'll
Yeah, I'm
have to
pretty
get
sure I
it
did, yes.
tomorrow.
Dr.
Oh my
Moskowitz,
God.
I was going to bring you the book, and of course today's events and
All right,
yesterday's
I'll
events
see
made.
tomorrow, okay.
All right, so we'll be in touch.
I don't
Okay,
have a
good.
book either, Rabbi.
Well, Sheila, so you got to reach out to me, and we'll be in touch, and we'll make it happen. Okay, good. So I'm going to try to do this all verbally instead of based on a text.
Maybe
We're
you
getting a
can-
feel for what.
Maybe you can leave your
So-
book at your front desk for me and let me know when it's there and I'll walk over and get
Yeah,
it.
come by. And that's what a number of people did. So just reach out to me, and we'll get you the books. All right, so I'll try to do this orally. Imagine a map. In Israel, that's where the Mishnah was written. Right after that, a large number of Jewish people had to flee Israel and move to Babylonia, which was a much more welcoming, tolerant society. And two students of Rabbi Yehuda founded the great academies of Bavel or Babylonia. But there was a core of Jews living in Israel, and they simultaneously engaged in the same process. So you had an academy in Israel discussing the Mishnah and trying to develop and fill in the blanks. And you had academies in Babylonia, in Iraq, doing the same thing.
That's why it's called Yom
And so what ends up happening tragically is that the project, that this process that was done in Israel is referred to, and we'll see it in the slide soon, as the Jerusalem Talmud. But the Jerusalem Talmud was aborted mid-mission. Israel becomes so terrible for the Jewish people. Those yeshivas, those academies end up being closed prematurely. And the final product didn't go through the same degree of editing, development, and rating. And today there is a text called the Jerusalem Talmud, which is a very challenging text to study because it's literally a manuscript that's frozen in time. And we're going to discuss more about it in a moment. But usually, when we talk about Talmud, we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. We're talking about the project and the ideas and the dialogues and the discussions as they were recorded in Iraq, in Bavel, in Babylonia. And that's the text of the Talmud. We're going to talk a little more. We're going to revisit that in a moment. So how does the Talmud address a Mishnah? How do we unpack a Mishnah? Again, I know because many of you don't have the book yet, I'm going to try to keep this more oral than written, and we can kind of relate to the Jewish story of a written text and oral text, right? So a Mishnah is a text, a shorthand text mentioning a certain Jewish law or instruction. And it is unpacked in three directions. We might say it is unpacked laterally. It is unpacked backwards and forwards. What do I mean? And for this, I'm going to have to actually stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to try to get you the text to put on the screen. So bear with me a moment. The people that are here, you can see what I'm doing, so you'll understand. But bear with me. Bear with me a moment. Here we go. Let's see if it downloaded. Okay, here now we can reshare the screen. Folks, thank you for your patience again. Here we go. This is the textbook. Let's zoom in. All right, so sorry, folks. Please don't get any vertigo. I'm feeling dizzy. So if you're feeling dizzy, I feel you. You can look away, and we'll get it for you in a moment. Here we go. The Mishnah is a central text, which is analyzed backwards. What does that mean, backwards? We want to go back in time and uncover the source. How did this idea develop? What inspired the Jewish law to be so? Is there a verse in the Bible that informs this? Or was there a particular issue facing the Jewish people which caused this law to be transcribed and developed as such? And what if there's a conflict between one text, one Mishnah, and another Mishnah? Or what if two rabbis are arguing? The Talmud will attempt to understand why one rabbi understands the situation one way and one understands it the other. There are other Talmudic analysis that we might call as lateral or parallel. For example, the Mishnah talks about the law of lighting Shabbat candles. Let's say, well, for example, yes. So are there other texts that are not part of the Mishnah that discuss those same ideas? The Talmud will be a reference to flag and bring to our attention those other texts. Are there contradictions between one Mishnah and another? The Talmud will attempt to resolve it. What if there are two opinions? Which opinion is followed in practice? That's a question the Talmud will address. Are there two texts that sound very similar? Why is there a redundancy in the Mishnah? The Talmud will ask that question and usually explain that it is not redundant. Each text addresses a different issue or subject. And the Talmud, most importantly, will go forward. We're talking about lighting Shabbat candles with oil or wax. What about a light bulb? Okay, the Talmud didn't have a light bulb, but that's the idea. The Talmud would move past the era of the Mishnah and discuss more contemporary developments that might have unfolded into the future. Talking about Hanukkah or Shabbat candles, what if they lived in a time in Persia where the Zoroastrians worshipped fire and didn't allow one to have fire? What should you do then? That was an issue that did not exist in the land of Israel. It existed in Babylonia, in Iraq. And so that would be something the Talmud would attempt to address, how to apply the idea forward. And so this is just a small sampling of different kinds of conversations that the Talmud will have to try to further develop the Mishnah. And then we go a step further. Okay, it's not in ours. Sometimes the Talmud will go beyond just extrapolation. What if there is a related topic about Jewish belief? So, for example, I'm right now teaching a segment in the Talmud, which is really devoted to talking about Shabbat. And it goes on to talk about Jewish belief in afterlife and the Jewish idea of seizing the moment, seizing today and making the most of today, because that's all we can be certain about. There is a segment in the Talmud that talks in that very same discussion that talks about the soul and the experience of the soul in heaven. Crazy, wild stuff that's certainly not legalistic, but important for Jewish thought, and all those kind of ideas, as well as parables and history that might be recorded in the that is recorded in the Talmud, even if it remained only an oral tradition between teacher and student. Continuing on the student, but well, actually, no, let me share the slides for a second. So just to recap, the Mishnah is developed laterally, backwards and forwards, the past, the present, the future. We analyze the Mishnah and comparing it to other parallel teachings. We try to trace the source and the principles that underlie the Mishnah, and we move forward to see how the Mishnah might inform a more contemporary, modern development.
Rabbi.
Then it goes beyond, I'm sorry, give me one more second. And then, as I mentioned, the Mishnah goes the Talmud goes beyond the Mishnah. It extends to sub-related topics, parables, history, philosophy, advice for daily life. Go ahead, please, sir.
What you're showing on the screen, I don't have anything on the screen. So that's in my book?
Yeah.
Are you
So you
showing
don't.
that
What do you see? No. Right now, I'm showing you slides, and this here is the book. Do you see? What do you see on the screen right now?
We're not seeing it.
We're not,
We're
the wheel is
seeing
turning.
a loading symbol.
I can see it on
I
my.
think. Hold on. I think that has to do with your internet, and I apologize for it. But if you'll go in your book to page 108, you'll be pretty 108, 109.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Okay, so student book 108 and 109. What is so profoundly important about the Mishnah? I'm sorry, the Talmud, is it is the last text that unites almost all the Jewish people. And I'll make it extreme. Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, and Reformed Jews can all trace back their heritage, maybe not their practice, but their intellectual heritage to the Talmud. Even more than that, Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, Yemenite Jews, Falashi, well, maybe not Falashi Jews, Italian Jews, Bukharian Jews, Jews of Spain and Morocco, and anywhere else that Jews existed in that time, they all have concurrently preserved texts of the Talmud, and that is the source they access for Jewish authoritative teachings and ideas. After the finish of the Talmud in around the year 500 or 600, there was never again a common project that was embraced and appreciated across the entire Jewish world. And so the Talmud is the very final text that all Jews, I don't want to say they can agree with, because Jews never agree, but all Jews can have a common language or common ideas. And that's another reason why the Talmud is so important. You could be a traveler living 700 years ago, going from Morocco to Italy or to France, or I don't know, somehow you managed to get to Russia, don't ask me how, or Poland. You might not speak a common language, but you'll have the common language of the Talmud. And that's something that's very profound. And it makes the Talmud very important. Ken Giveret.
Fast, is it printed?
It was a handwritten. It was printed before the invention. Yeah, before the invention of the printing press, the Talmud was formalized. And so the Talmud was originally a manuscript written by hand or copied by hand, but
All these boxes.
yeah, but I'm trying to find the right. I want to find you a picture that we have in the student book. Again, if you're getting vertigo, I apologize. The Talmud, we had it. I'm sorry, I don't know where. Here we go.
Rabbi.
Here we go. Yes.
That's the one?
Yes,
I
Lynn,
have
go
a
ahead.
question. I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, the Talmud was written many, many years ago.
Indeed.
So there would never be any changes that would develop now. Would there be any changes? Because like that was the Talmud is an updated version of the Mishnah, but would there be any further updates
Oh,
that
so you're
needed to be
asking
recorded?
You're asking a profoundly important question. And the answer is yes, there's a whole lot of development, ongoing scholarship from the time the Talmud is finished till today. But what distinguishes between the Talmud and any future work is its authority across all of the Jewish people. From the time after the Talmud, you're going to have difference of opinion between different communities. And so the Talmud is a common intellectual heritage, and everything else you may find differing opinions. And so just one more thing before we jump back onto our
Wait a minute,
slides.
but wait 1 second, Rabbi. But if
Yes.
there are differing opinions, are they written down someplace?
Yes. So for example, when it comes to kosherizing dishes, there are differences of opinion between Jews who originate from Spain and Jews who originate from Poland. And a Jew who originates from Spain, who we call Sephardic Jews, they would kosherize glass dishes, for example. But a Jew from Poland would not. Now, the reason why I don't want to go much further is because that's going to be next week's discussion. Next week, we're going to talk about the scholarship that follows the Talmud.
Okay, so I'm ahead of myself. All right.
You're always at the cutting edge.
I'm
You're
ahead of
always at the
myself.
cutting edge. Here, folks, I'm going to hit mute on. I'm going to ask you to unmute, because I think there's some people that don't intend to be recorded. So again, I hit mute. You just have to unhit mute to continue the conversation. And so the Talmud is a certain genre of scholarship. It's the last consensus text. What happens afterwards, which is a brilliant and important question, is going to be the subject of next 3 weeks. So the Talmud has a unique authority as the documentation of the oral Torah, and there's no subsequent work that has the same standing. And when the Talmud was finished, it was the end of an era. It was the last time all of the Jewish people accepted a central authority. Then they were dispersed across the globe. How did that happen? Well, part of it had to do with oppression. Part of it had to do with the fact that communication was fraught. And it also has to do with the fact that the Central Academy in Babylonia, in Iraq, which had a great degree of authority, started to become decentralized. And so Judaism became a lot more decentralized after the close of the Talmud. Now, my dear friends, the hour is late. I want to briefly touch upon, again, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. But the reason why I want to go through this kind of fast is I want to take the final minutes we have and study a text from the Talmud. So that was the end of an era. As I mentioned, there are 2 Talmuds. There was the Jerusalem Talmud, composed in the Holy Land of Israel, between the years 200 and 350. That project, as I mentioned previously, was aborted mid-process due to great Jewish oppression. The Babylonian Talmud continues for another 150 years or so, 155 according to our slides, after the Jerusalem Talmud. And so they managed to incorporate many of the teachings that were brought from the Holy Land, as well as further develop. But there's another very big distinction. And this distinction is style. The Babylonian Talmud is a more definitive version. The Jerusalem Talmud was written during the Roman Empire, many oppressions. The Babylonian Talmud was mostly done under the Parthian Empire, where Jews had a lot of autonomy. the varying styles. The Jerusalem Talmud is a lot more direct, and it records much less of the deliberation. It's much more of fact than dialogue. The Babylonian Talmud has a little bit more of a meandering, winding approach. It presents a hypothesis, and then it will either embrace, support, or reject it. There's a lot more dialogue. The Talmud style of the Jerusalem Talmud is compared to looking for something in the light. When the light is on, all you need to do is glance around the room, and you immediately see the item you're looking for. The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, is called, it's like you're groping in the dark. You want to find where the light switch is? Well, you got to kind of figure out what's the wall, and is that the wall? And then you try to figure out the height. And then if you're looking for, you drop your glasses in the dark, you got to feel around. Is that my glasses? No, that's a shoe. Is that my glasses? No, that's, that's the tiles. And so it's compared to a much more, it's a process where you start with much less information. We'll contemplate and either reject or accept different theories that are presented. It's a strenuous process with discovery and rejection. As a matter of fact, the Talmud itself says, the Jerusalem style is like Noam, it's gracious. And the Babylonian Talmud, it's a lot more confrontational. It's assaulting. Two scholars would argue and debate and disagree. And you could almost imagine there was raised voices. It was a much more lively development. So again, the Babylonian version is considered more Talmudic. It's more analytical. The Babylonian Talmud less so. Okay, now we're going to jump into, with your permission, we're going to actually sample the Talmud. Sugya. So there's a Hebrew or Aramaic word called sugya. Sugya means subject or matter, item for discussion. So how does the Talmud work? The Talmud works where it'll have a specific question. Like right now, we're going to talk about the laws of possession. And this is just a small example. Possession. I'm sorry? Do you see the screen now? Or
We do
possession. Now. Okay, possession. Possession. So how does it work? First, the Talmud will want to know, is there a biblical source to this opinion? Number two, are there other contrasting opinions or texts? And we'll attempt to apply the ideas gleaned from one Mishnah to other cases. And today we're going to start off with a very important and well-known example. In Hebrew, shnayim ochazim bitalit. If two individuals are grappling over a garment. And Ken, one second. So now I'm going to share with you the screen with the student book so we can appreciate, and again, lots of scrolling. Bear with me. Here we go. So two people are grasping a garment. This is a Mishnah that you're reading right now. And again, of course, translations never do full justice to the original text, but we'll do our best. Two people are grasping a garment. This one says, I found it. This one says, I found it. Each one is making a full 100% claim that the garment is theirs. This one says, all of it is mine. And this one says, all of it is mine. Again, in the Hebrew, it's a little more delicate and compact. So what do? Two people come into the court, each one claiming the item, the article is theirs. You know what you do? This one should swear that his share in it is no less than half. This one swears that his share in it is no less than half, and they divide it. Now, admittedly, good luck trying to cut a pair of pants or jeans in half. So what you'd have to do is one person would have to buy the other person out. But this is the text of the Mishnah. So again, a seemingly straightforward issue, both people claiming ownership, neither has a receipt, neither has any proof that it's theirs. What do you do? Sounds straightforward. But what the Talmud will do is a careful analysis of the intricate reading of the word, the exact wording. So is there anything here that catches your attention? What is that?
It reminds me of Mishpat Shlomo.
Okay, so you have two people grappling, but anything else that's funny over here? So first things first, how do we know that a person gets to keep that which they are holding onto? Does it make sense that just because you're holding onto something, you should get to keep it? So here is a line from the Talmud that teaches us a very important rule. I think in English we call this possession is 9/10 of the law. Are you familiar with this line?
Right.
If you've got something in your possession, that is the most compelling case that it's yours. But is there a Jewish origin to this idea? So here is the Talmud. Said Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, who is one of the great sages of the Talmud. From where do we know the rule that one who is seeking to take property from his fellow possession, it is incumbent upon him to provide evidence. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. From the verse, whoever has a matter for adjudication shall approach them, meaning he must present evidence. So the Talmud starts by giving us a biblical verse that points to the need for evidence. And absent evidence, who gets to keep the item? Person who has possession. In Hebrew, the word is chazaka. Chazaka means that the reality presumes that the person that has it is the person that owns it. Is that confusing? A little bit. Lynn, you're muted. Please unmute so we can hear you. You're still muted. You have to hit here, hit yes. It's not letting me unmute you. You have to unmute. Do you see
I see it.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
but that's not necessarily true, that if the person has it, it means they originally owned it. That may not be true.
True. But if you're to make the case that it's not the person who has it in their possession, you're gonna have to bring a compelling case. You're gonna have to provide a receipt or a witness or somebody to affirm that it's actually yours. But absent evidence, the default is that it's going to stay in the possession of the person that owns it.
But
What is the point?
It could have been stolen.
It could be
from the
stolen.
other person.
And so if something is stolen from you, you should be able to have evidence that was actually yours, like a receipt or a Facebook post with you posing with your brand new jeans or your friend or a picture, right? So if there's no proof, what can you do? It's one of the great travesties of life, which is that sometimes you're wronged, but if you cannot prove it, you cannot. Anyways, but let's focus at the issue at hand. What I really wanted to present for you here is the fact that we have a Mishnah that talks about you get to keep what you're holding on to. And the first thing we needed to do is there a biblical source? And so he brought a verse in the Bible that says, yeah, if you want to take something away from somebody else's possession, the possessor is the presumed owner, and you need to bring evidence to change the status quo, to change the balance. Let me share the screen again. Let's not go there. Let's not go there now. Let's try to focus on this specific one for now. Okay. Now, there's a funny language here. Did you notice the language? It doesn't say two people have a deed or two people anything. All it says is two people are grasping it. They are both in possession of it. And neither one has a stronger hold than the other. Each one, this snapshot of this moment, each one has an equal claim. But if only one of them is holding the garment, then who has the garment in their possession? The guy who's holding it. The one who wants to take it would need to bring proof. And so the Mishnah uses very precise language. They need to both be grasping, because a verbal claim would be insufficient for us to make or take decisive action. So the language of ochazin, holding onto, is very precise to allude to this notion, this idea of chazakah, of presumed ownership. So what if nobody is holding on to it? Then what do you do? So if nobody's holding on to it, you know what we do? Well, actually, I'm going to go through this fast because the Talmud continues and says, let's say a boat floats into the harbor, or Lynn, across from Positano, you have that park where you have all those boats.
Right.
And unfortunately, there people abandon their boats. That's a terrible thing. They don't want to dispose of it, so they just drop it there. And the city can't really do much about it. It's a problem. But suppose two people both claim that the boat in the harbor is theirs, and they come into court. So what do? So the Talmud then says, in such a case, we don't get involved. We do not decide who it belongs to. The court remains uninvolved. You know why the court remains uninvolved? Because neither one of the parties at present can give us any evidence that it's theirs. And so this is a contrasting ruling. When two people say they own it and they're holding it, you split it. When two people claim they own it and only one person is holding on to it, the guy holding on to it keeps it. And if nobody's holding on to it, the court says, get out of court and figure it out or bring us proof. And until then, we're not going to mix into your yes.
Sorry.
What's interesting, I'm sorry, someone saying something? What's interesting is there is a third parallel Mishnah, which seems to say a very different sentiment. I'm going to try to share with you the student book again. Here we go. This is the story of the boat that I told you outside. This is a beautiful artistic rendering of the Sanhedrin, the High Court, right? You could tell that this was depicted in an Oriental or Far East kind of environment. Isn't that beautiful? What if the case is a little different? Two people entrusted money with a third party. One deposited 100 dinar, the other deposited 200. Each one says the 200 are mine, and the other one says the 200 are mine. Now, obviously, the depositor should have made a note, but he didn't have a note. So you know what we do? Each one agrees that the other one gets 100. So we give each one 100. The remainder is put away for all time until one of them can fess up. Said Rabbi Yosef, if we do that, the swindler loses nothing. Rather, we should hold on to all the money. So there's a case that sounds very similar. Both people gave something that was in their possession, and yet we don't say to split it. So that's a funny case that doesn't seem to be consistent with what we said. Previously, our Mishnah says if two people have a solid claim, they both get we split it. Here, they both have a claim. We both know that they have some kind of connection. So why here don't we split it? Why here do we leave it in escrow forever or until one of them fesses up? And so the Talmud gives a beautiful explanation. And the explanation is over here. You know the difference is? In this case of the disputed deposit, one of the two is lying. One of the two is for sure scamming the other. One of the two is being dishonest. There is certainly a swindler. Oh, but what about our case where two people are both holding on to a garment? In our case, how do we know there's a swindler? Maybe they picked the item up at the very same time. And so they both were legitimate claimants. They both really were partners in this ownership. And now we go back to the original Mishnah, and wow, it all makes sense. Why does the Mishnah only talk about a case where they're both holding on to it? Because the Mishnah is using very strategic and precise language. If they're both holding on to it and they found it, the odds are they're both honest, upstanding people. But in a case where they both deposited and there's monkey business, there we're not going to divide it. Because there's a swindler and we're not going to accommodate the ganef. We're not going to help the ganef out. So now I want to show you a beautiful chart that the JLI put together here. Actually, I think it might be on our slide. So let me see here. Bear with me. Here we go. So two people claim a property, but neither litigant has witnesses or other definitive proof supporting their claim. They don't have a receipt. There's no Facebook post, nothing. So what do you do? Well, the first question is, how many litigants are in possession of the property? If one person is holding on to the property, he gets to hold on to that item till the other person brings proof. If neither of them are holding on to it, like our case with the boat, the court says this is not a case for the court. Go fight it out outside. Go take it outside. But if there's two people holding on or can prove that they both have a chain of custody, well, then there's an important question. Can we be certain that one of them is lying? If the answer is yes, then it has to remain in trust. It has to remain in escrow. We are not going to award one of them if we know one of them is lying. But if no, it's a good chance that they're both being honest. So then the Talmud says we would divide the property.
But
and
you
so
can't divide a boat. You can't, but you can't divide a boat.
Well, you could sell it, which is what the court does. The court would sell it and either disperse the funds or compel one of the partners to buy out the other. But anyways, the Talmud says we never divide a boat because the boat has a title and the title has a chain of custody. And so one person is lying. And so the court is not going to take possession. And should the court happen to have possession, they're not going to release it until one of them fesses up. So again, one Mishnah, shorthand, but so much information is alluded to in very subtle language. It's only if they're both holding on. It's only if it was found. And the nuanced language used excludes the other cases. And so this is just a small example of how the Talmud would take a seemingly straightforward text and ask, hey, there's another text that sounds different. Can we make sense of them? Yes. Well, there's another case we haven't considered. Can we try to make sense of that? The answer is yes. And that is a small snapshot of the formula of the Talmud. The reality is that sometimes the Talmud will preserve, many times, the Talmud will preserve two different points of view and won't fully take a position because Judaism is full of contrasting views and perspectives, and we are encouraged to become comfortable with occasionally considering that different people process information differently, and they can have different conclusions that are both within the legitimate framework of the Jewish tradition and Jewish dialogue. And
But Rabbi, today, real courts decide this. It's not
correct.
the Jewish court that decides this. A real court would decide this.
This is correct. So in today's day and age,
Right.
the Jewish court would have a lot less, or wouldn't have much to contribute beyond the hypothetical, except in the American legal system, there's court, and then sometimes the courts want the two litigants to go to mediation. And there's different forms of mediation. And one of the forms of mediation that is acknowledged and recognized by the United States legal system is what we call a bet din, a Jewish law mediation. And so there are courts where when both litigants agree to follow Jewish law, the United States legal system allows for the two litigants to present themselves between a Jewish court. And a Jewish court would use the principles, or many of the principles, of Jewish law. But of course, because Jews do not have an autonomous legal system, and even in the state of Israel, where it's a Jewish state, the government there, and I know it's a very fraught and present issue, so I don't want to weigh in it, but the one thing I can tell you for sure is that the courts in Israel are not following Jewish law. They're following common law and specifically developed legal based on, more contemporary issues. There are occasions, I want to be clear, that Jewish Israeli law does borrow from Jewish law, but it is not inherently a Jewish court. It doesn't follow the Talmud. And so, my dear friends,
But Rabbi, but I have a question about this. So then, if there are courts, common law courts, then how useful is the Talmud? In other words, if disagreements are solved in a court of law, how useful is the Talmud?
I'll tell you, the Talmud is not only about litigation. The Talmud has a segment that talks about litigation and tort and damages, and but much of the Talmud is not about that. It's about how to do Shabbat and how to do Passover and how to have a field and do you give gifts to the poor and how to give charity. And so the bulk of the Talmud is not a kind of thing that the legal system would take its place. But admittedly, there are areas of the Talmud law that is not so practiced today. I'll give you another example. There are laws that talk about the temple ritual. Unfortunately, the Jewish temple does not stand. And so all of those facets of the Talmud and the Mishnah and Jewish law are abstract, theoretic, but the spiritual impact that was once achieved through through practice, according to the Jewish tradition, when we keep those ideas alive and we study them, we're able to create some of that energy, some of that connection with the divine, as if we'd actually practiced it. And so, my dear friends, I'm sure there's a lot of questions that remain, but I hope you have a little bit more clarity about what the Talmud is, when it was composed, why it was composed, and why it is such a central text to the Jewish people till this day. Now, I'm going to end the, actually, no, here, I'm going to stop. No, before I do that, hold on one second. Give me another moment. I promise you I'd look for.
Can I get some advice?
Go ahead,
Are you-
yes.
Are you running right now after everyone gets off? Because I kind of need some advice from you on something.
I
Are you-
am. I'll have a brief moment, but I won't have a lot of time. And also, there's people here in the room, so
Yeah, no, I'm
it's
saying
not-
after they, yeah.
I
It
think
can
we're
always
going
be
to have
another
to.
time. I just want
We'll have to make another time, but let's
Yeah.
make another time.
Okay,
Hold on,
okay.
folks. Bear with me. She Vish. Okay, for some reason, hold on. Let's just bear with me. This concludes the formal. Okay, I'm gonna have to find it and I'll have to share it with you because it's very funny. But unfortunately, I'm not finding it now, so I'll have to share it with you another time. So, my dear friends, this ends the formal part of the class. I'm gonna stop the recording, but I'll stick around. If you have any other questions or things that need to be addressed, listen, the Talmud is a